All right, so we're going to watch this video on the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson and his administration. This is all on in chapter 11. I'm going to stop it at certain times and talk about some things, and then you'll have this that you can go back and read and watch and all that good stuff. So we had mentioned the rise of political parties with Washington, and how he had Alexander Hamilton and he had Jefferson, and these two had very different competing visions for what they saw America as being in the future. John Adams is the second president of the United States. He wins in 1796, and then he runs again. And in 1800, he runs against Thomas Jefferson, who is now part of the Democratic Republican Party. And John Adams is part of the Federalist Party. Watch this video.
What's up, everyone? Today we're taking a look at Jeffersonian America. We're going to cover the period 1800 to 1812, and let's get right into it. So in 1800, there's an election, and John Adams is running again for a second term, and he's doing a rematch with Thomas Jefferson. And in the election of 1800, Federalists lost control of both not only the presidency, the executive branch, but also Congress, the legislative branch.
All right, before he goes any further, I want to talk a little more about the election because it's actually interesting. We had a tie. So before the 12th Amendment was passed, the Electoral College was really weird, and the electors, let me show you a picture of the Electoral College from that year. So you had the electors for each party. Essentially, they would get 2 votes. Well, so when you voted for the president, you would also vote for the vice president for that person. So, for instance, John Adams was the presidential nominee. Pinckney was the vice president nominee. Well, in order to keep a tie from happening, one of the electors would just throw their vote away. So you see, for the Federalists, they did that. John Adams got 65, Pinckney got 64, and then one of the people, the electors who was going to vote for Pinckney, just threw his vote away to John Jay. So that way, Adams would have the lead. That way, Adams would become the president if he had won the election, if he had gotten more electoral votes than Thomas Jefferson. However, for the Democratic Republicans that year, one of the dudes forgot to throw his vote away. And so you ended up with a tie. Now, when you end up with a tie, what ends up happening is essentially it goes to the Congress, and the Congress decides. It's kind of a convoluted system in how they pick. It's not every congressman gets a vote. It's every state gets a vote. So in order to resolve this tie, Congress voted and voted and voted, and each time it ended up being a tie. Well, Alexander Hamilton, who, remember, is a bitter rival of Thomas Jefferson's, he steps in and he goes to members of Congress and he convinces them that Thomas Jefferson would be the best candidate over Aaron Burr. And so he convinces members of Congress to vote for Thomas Jefferson because he thought, even though I disagree with Thomas Jefferson, I do think that he has the nation's best interest at heart, and he'll do what's best for the country, at least even if it's a view that I disagree with. I know he's not going to completely destroy the nation. Whereas he did not trust Aaron Burr. He thought Aaron Burr was an opportunist and was someone that was just looking out for himself and didn't really care that much about the country. So they ended up voting one last time, and Thomas Jefferson becomes president. Now, what that means is John Adams is now going to be he's still going to be president between the end of the election and when Thomas Jefferson is sworn in. It's called a lame duck president, that time period. So during that time period, John Adams is going, and some of the other Federalists, they are going to they're going to pass a law that allows them to create more judges in the judicial branch. So you got 3 branches of government. You've got the executive branch, legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Well, in this election, the Federalists lost both the executive branch and the legislative branch. So their only hope, real hope at this point to maintain any kind of power is to take over the judicial system. So they pass a law to create more judicial positions, and they put a bunch of Federalists in those positions, so they'll at least have control of one arm or one branch of the federal government. And that's what this guy's about to talk about. Let's go back to this.
And Thomas Jefferson becomes the first Democratic Republican president ever in our nation's history. And some people refer to it as the Revolution of 1800. And it's not a revolution in the sense of violence or a radical change. It is the first peaceful transfer of power between political parties.
Make sure you are familiar with the terms in red. You need to know these terms in bold red. So the Revolution of 1800 simply refers to the election of 1800 when the Democratic Republicans won and we have a change of power from one political party to another.
And it really shows the constitutional system was working and power was handed over peacefully. In fact, Jefferson even says at his inaugural address, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists, and the nation's going to continue to function, even though political parties are there and power is transferring between one and the other. The Federalists are not going to go away without a fight. In fact, they're going to try to take control of the judicial branch, and they wanted to maintain some grip on power, and Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801. And what this act basically did is it created new judicial positions, new judge positions that needed to be filled, and these are going to be filled with Federalist candidates at the last minute of John Adams' administration. They're called the midnight appointments because basically they're filling them with pro-Federalist people, and it's an attempt by Adams' administration to put Federalist judges in place before leaving office.
They could also be called midnight judges. So midnight appointments, midnight judges, either way. And they're known as that because they were done at the last minute of his administration, literally the last few days of his administration, in an attempt to take over the judicial branch.
They lost the executive, they lost the legislative, they're trying to maintain control of the judicial branch. And something very important happens when one of the midnight judicial appointees, a guy by the name of William Marbury, sued the Secretary of State, James Madison, for refusing to deliver his commission.
All right, real quick. So James Madison is Jefferson's Secretary of State. So they come into power. The Jefferson administration comes into power. William Marbury is not given his commission as one of those judicial appointees. So he sues James Madison, the Secretary of State, to try to get that commission. So you have a case called Marbury versus Madison. Extremely important court case that you need to know.
And this is important because it's one of the most important cases in U.S. history. It leads to the case Marbury versus Madison. And here's what happens. Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court decides in 1803 the following. Parts of the Judiciary Act of 1789 was ruled unconstitutional. And you don't really need to worry about all the details there. Super important point. This established the idea of judicial review. What this means is the Supreme Court has the power to declare federal laws unconstitutional. So the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, determines the meaning of the Constitution. This is a massive expansion of judicial power, and it's just one of many decisions that we're going to see with the Chief Justice, John Marshall. He will dramatically increase the power of the federal government.
All right, real quick. This Marbury versus Madison case, Marbury loses the case, so he doesn't get his commission. So you would think, well, then the Federalists lost that case. They didn't really gain anything. But in reality, the Federalists gain an enormous amount of power here because remember what their view is. The Federalists want to increase the power of the federal government. They think the federal government should be a massive entity that has enormous amounts of control and power. Well, this particular decision gives the Supreme Court the power to declare federal laws unconstitutional, and it's a massive expansion of judicial power, and it essentially gives the federal government an enormous amount of power. So the reason why this is important, though, the number one reason, forget the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, is it establishes a precedent that will be in place for the rest of time, where if Congress passes a law and someone sues over this law and they say, look, it's violating my constitutional rights or whatever, the Supreme Court of the United States can overturn that law with a 5-4 vote. Even if Congress voted for the law overwhelmingly, 100% of congressmen voted for this law. You had the president sign it. You had 99% of Americans that supported the law. If 5 justices say, I don't like it, because there's 9 on the Supreme Court, if 5 justices say it's against or it's unconstitutional, then it is ruled unconstitutional and it no longer exists. That is an enormous amount of power for the courts. And later on, they're going to expand this power to include state laws, all kinds of even decisions made by lower courts. Okay, so all of that's going to be in the works later on. And Chief Justice John Marshall is a Federalist. Do not be tricked into thinking he's something else. He is a Federalist. He wants the power of the court to increase, and he wants the power of the federal government to increase.
He's going to play a key role. We'll cover some other cases, but make sure you know Marbury versus Madison and judicial review. Now back to Jefferson. How revolutionary was this transfer of political power? How Jeffersonian was Jefferson? Remember, the Jeffersonian Democratic Republican Party was really created by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, and they believed in a couple of things, such as a strict interpretation of the Constitution, limited federal government. Remember, they were the state rights guys, and they believed in a nation of farmers. So was this a revolution of 1800? Well, Jefferson has some policies. He eliminated the excise taxes, especially the one on whiskey. He wanted to lower the national debt. He wanted to reduce the size of the military. He pardoned those who were arrested under the Sedition Act. So he does a lot of things differently, but important to note, he does not dismantle all of the Federalist policies. He keeps the Bank of the United States. He doesn't mess with that assumption plan. In fact, even though he reduces the size of the military, he sends the Navy over to the Barbary pirates to go try to fight them off rather than paying tribute. So Jefferson doesn't undo everything that happened under Washington and Adams administrations. Jefferson's most famous moment comes when he attempted to buy New Orleans and a part of Florida from France. And really some background here is needed. Spain had ended the right of deposit granted in the Picnics Treaty of 1795, this free use of the port, tax-free use of the port. They ended that, and at this point, France had taken back control over the Louisiana Territory. Napoleon had gotten it back from Spain, and he really wanted to establish or reestablish a French empire in North America. So Jefferson sends over James Monroe to buy this land for $10 million, that land right there in the blue. Some things happen. Napoleon offers to sell all of the Louisiana Territory for $15 million, and this is a huge chunk of land. A couple of reasons why. One, there's a revolution in Haiti, a slave revolt that was not only scaring Southern slaveholders in America, it was causing all sorts of havoc for the French. Napoleon needed money to crush this rebellion, and he also needed money in his really intense fight against England that was going on throughout Europe. So he offers to sell this huge chunk of land to the United States. He abandons his dream of a new French empire in North America, and as a result, we get one of the best real estate bargains ever. Now, important to note, although the Constitution does not say the president could purchase foreign land, it's not in the Constitution, Jefferson supported the deal. And this is really important to note because Jefferson used a loose interpretation of the Constitution and the idea of implied powers to make the deal. Remember, he's a strict interpreter of the Constitution, so he does not follow his principles, and he does so anyways. He says the president has the power to make treaties, therefore this deal can get made, and it is made, and it's important that it was.
All right, real quick, let's go back to this. So how Jeffersonian was Jefferson? So what did he do that was different from the Federalists? Well, a couple things that he did. First of all, he believes in strict interpretation of the Constitution. In other words, if the Constitution gives me the power to do something, then I have the power to do it. If it does not give me explicitly the power to do something, then I do not have the power to do it. If you're Jefferson, that's what you would be thinking. So, in other words, the Constitution says that if the Constitution does not say that I can create the post office, then I can't create it. It has to give me explicit power to do so. So he is a strict interpretation. Uh, he believes in strict interpretation of the Constitution and a limited federal government. All right, so some of his policies, he eliminated excise tax, which is good. He lowered the national debt, which was good, and those were consistent with his ideas. However, one of the things that he hated that was put in place uh, during the Washington administration was the Bank of the United States. He thought it was unconstitutional because the Constitution did not give the federal government the power to create this, and he opposed it, deeply opposed it. Well, when he becomes president, he does not get rid of it. He also hated the economic plan of Hamilton's, which was really the foundational point for the American economy. He opposed it dramatically, but then when he becomes president, he pretty much leaves it alone. And part of that plan was that Hamilton wanted to have a little bit of debt. It was important that the United States had a little bit of debt because it if you owed other countries money, they would be more likely to support your success. They want you to succeed so that way you can pay back the money, some kind of theory like that. So he ends up keeping that plan in place. One of the issues that pops up during his administration is buying New Orleans. So he wants to buy New Orleans from France, who wants to sell it. And he ends up getting offered the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million. It ends up being I want to say I don't remember the exact amount, but it was less than $1 per acre for all of this land. Right here is where the United States ends at this point, and he's got the opportunity to basically double the land of the United States for $15 million. It's an incredible deal. However, the Constitution doesn't say, hey, the president can buy land for the United States. It doesn't say that. So he would be opposed to doing this because he believes in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. So he gets around this by signing a treaty because the Constitution does say he can sign a treaty. So he signs a treaty with France called the Louisiana Purchase Treaty, and they end up, the Senate confirms it, and he buys all of this land and doubles the land of the United States. Now, one of the reasons why he wanted this land is obviously because of the good deal that he was getting, but also this would sort of help his vision of everyone owning their own plot of land, everyone being a farmer, being in agriculture, being self-sufficient. This would help that plan, that vision that he had, because it would spread out the United States and we could spread west and go and own our own land and be self-sufficient that way. We wouldn't have to be so condensed in this and confined in this little area. Make sure you know loose interpretation of the Constitution, which is not what Jefferson is, but he kind of took that approach to get the Louisiana Territory.
This deal can get made, and it is made, and it's important that it was, because the Louisiana Purchase is hugely important. It doubles the size of the United States before the Louisiana Purchase, after the Louisiana Purchase. Huge chunk of land, as you can see. Not only that, it supports Jefferson's vision of an agrarian society of independent farmers. He wanted a nation of farmers. This potentially can fulfill that vision. So Jefferson feels okay with abandoning his constitutional principles during this deal. Another important thing about the Louisiana Purchase is it avoided a potential threat, France, along the nation's borders. If Napoleon would have been successful at reestablishing a French empire, this would have been a nightmare for the United States, and so they avoid that. It further weakened the Federalist Party because, keep in mind, this territory is not going to be urban or industrial like Hamilton and the Federalists favored. It's going to be agricultural, and so that's going to be a blow to the Federalist Party, and they're going to oppose the Louisiana Purchase, but it's still going to get done. Lewis and Clark actually lead a scientific exploration of the Trans-Mississippi West. Lewis was the personal secretary of Jefferson, and Clark was an army officer for about 2.5 years. Them and a bunch of dudes go exploring, looking at the geography, making scientific studies, and really important, this begins the start of U.S. claims to the Oregon Territory as they get over to this region by the end of their expedition, and claims to the Pacific coast, which is going to lead us into all sorts of conflict with other nations, including Native Americans eventually. Quick little side story about Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was vice president during Jefferson's first term of office. He's dropped in the second term when Jefferson's reelected in 1804.
This guy's crazy. Pay attention to this.
He starts doing some wild things. He actually plotted with some radical Federalists to secede New England states from the Union. They were going to create their own nation, and Alexander Hamilton helped defeat Aaron Burr in the New York election. There's some personal insults that are exchanged, and Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr end up in a duel in which the great Federalist leader, Alexander Hamilton, is killed by Aaron Burr.
So if you think that today people are acting crazy over elections because they're going into the Capitol and busting out some windows and doing things like that, this is not the first time that people have acted, a little unconventional at the end of an election. The American story has always had very visceral reactions to politics. And Aaron Burr is a perfect example of this. Literally tried to secede the entire New England territory or the New England states from the Union in order to start their own nation because he didn't like, who was in charge of the government. And then Burr and Hamilton end up fighting in a duel, and Burr kills Alexander Hamilton. So, I mean, it's easy to fall into the media hype of thinking that, oh my gosh, we've never seen anything like what we're seeing today. In reality, it's been happening since the beginning of our republic. People have always been very, very passionate about what's going on in our capital, and the recent events in Washington, D.C. are just another example in a long string of examples of that taking place.
Former vice president killing the great secretary of the Treasury. At this point, the political career of Aaron Burr is done. He goes on the run. He actually plotted to take part of Mexico from Spain and potentially unite it with Louisiana territory under his rule. Eventually, he's put on trial for treason, but he is acquitted of the charges. And that's a little just about the crazy of politics back in the 1800s.
So crazy doesn't just exist today. It's been around for a long time.
Now back to the foreign policy drama. Remember, we were trying to maintain our neutrality policies not only under George Washington, but under John Adams, and the war in Europe continued to cause problems for the United States. The Napoleonic Wars were going on, and this was a big problem because there were various violations of U.S. neutrality. Impressment was taking place. This was the forced enlistment of Americans into the British Navy. They would actually seize ships, take the men off those ships, and force them into the British Navy, and this was no bueno.
Essentially impressment, and both the French and the British engaged in this, but the British did it on a larger scale. But impressment is basically kidnapping. They were kidnapping Americans and pushing them into the British Navy or the French Navy and forcing them to work on these ships.
France issued the Berlin Decree in 1806 that said they would seize ships that were trying to trade with England. So many American ships and its cargo were seized by France. England issued their own orders in council in 1806 that said ships that were going to Europe to trade must stop in England first. So once again, U.S. neutrality is being tested. The big moment happens, though, with an event called the Chesapeake Leopard Affair in 1807. An English ship known as the Leopard attacked an American ship, the Chesapeake. It is attacked right off the coast of Virginia. In fact, they're demanding surrender of some deserters. There was a refusal by the American ship, and shots are fired. 3 Americans are killed, 4 others are taken and forced into the British Navy, and there is a huge outcry in the United States.
All right, first of all, this is all dealing with foreign policy under Jefferson, so keep that in mind. And the big issue, or the big issues for foreign policy under his administration, were that we just wanted to trade with other European nations, and we wanted to do it freely without any kind of interference. Well, both France and England were interfering, so we didn't like either one of them doing what they were doing. But we end up going to war with England because of the Chesapeake Leopard affair, some other issues that he'll probably talk about here in just a second. But also because, remember, the Democratic Republicans tended to side with France. And even though they're angering us, they still liked France more than they liked England.
There's a huge demand for war, a lot of pressure on Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson's response is not to go to war. His response to the Chesapeake incident is to issue the Embargo Act of 1807. This Embargo Act basically said all U.S. trade would be banned with all foreign nations. You can't go to any destination to trade. The impact of the embargo.
All right, think about this. We're not going to trade with any nation. That's going to destroy our economy. So it wasn't very well thought out to put this in play. We thought it would hurt them more than it hurt us, but it didn't.
Embargo Act was negative. The U.S. economy plummeted. You can see that right here on this graph. There is a huge decline in the value of not only exports but imports, and especially in the New England region, because of their reliance on shipping and trade, their economy was hurt the most. There was widespread smuggling to try to evade this Embargo Act, but nonetheless, it backfired and American interest suffered. Little unintended consequences that happened as a result of the Embargo Act. It helped fuel the Industrial Revolution in the New England region. Remember, Jefferson was more in favor of agriculture. Hamilton was the industrial guy. Well, Jefferson's policy helped fuel the Industrial Revolution in America.
The reason is because we couldn't trade with England anymore, so we had to figure out how to create these goods ourselves. So in New England, they started creating factories and doing a lot of the things that we had relied on Britain to do.
Because if no goods are coming in from England or France, Americans start making them on their own, and eventually this Industrial Revolution will only spread. Just before Jefferson leaves office, he decides to repeal the Embargo Act, and shortly after that, James Madison, his homie, the Secretary of State, becomes president in 1809. The Embargo Act is repealed, and it's actually replaced by something called the Non-Intercourse Act. Get your minds out of the gutter. In 1809, the United States could trade with all nations except France and England. And the whole idea behind this was to shut down trade with the nations that were violating our neutrality. It didn't do much to help the economy. The economy still sucked. Eventually, the Non-Intercourse Act was replaced by Macon's Bill number 2. This bill said the U.S. would end its embargo if the country, whether it be France or England, respected U.S. neutrality and freedom of the seas. So in essence, we would stop trading with their rival. If France agrees to stop violating our neutrality, we'd stop our trade with England. Macon's Bill number 2 doesn't really work either. France temporarily agrees, but then they start seizing U.S. ships all over again. An important development happens in 1810 when members of Congress are elected. They take office in 1811, and these guys are known as the War Hawks. These are young congressmen, mainly from the South and the West. So you got John C. Calhoun right there on the left from South Carolina, and then, of course, you got the famous Henry Clay from Kentucky, and they take office in 1811, and they are advocates. They advocated for war against England.
Not only did they want war against England because of what was going on, they also wanted to take over Canada and some other things. But these guys are going to play major roles in United States history from this point forward. But they're elected in 1810. They take office in 1811, and they are the War Hawks. So this is a change in, in the approach to England.
Got a couple of reasons they want to stop British harassment of American shipping. They also want to wipe out native resistance on the frontier. They feel the British are fueling that resistance by giving them weapons, and they want Canada as a part of the United States. They want to take it from England.
They use a lot of propaganda to push this narrative that we need to go to war with England. And some of it was true, some of it was not true, but they wanted war, so they were going to get it.
So these guys start pressuring James Madison for war. A little bit about native resistance on the frontier you should know about. Know about these two Shawnee brothers. You got one, Tecumseh, right there on the left, and his brother, the Prophet, a religious leader. They began to organize a confederacy of tribes east of the Mississippi River. They were tired of Americans encroaching on their land, so they're going to resist and organize all the tribes in the region. They have some success, but unfortunately for them, eventually a general by the name of William Henry Harrison, who was governor of Indiana Territory, organized an army and attacked native resistance in 1811 at the Battle of Tippecanoe. And this is a huge blow for the Native Americans on the frontier. At the Battle of Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison becomes a war hero. He'll become president later on, and it's a big blow to native resistance and a win for American expansion. All of these developments that we've already been covering eventually lead to the War of 1812 being declared. James Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war, and he gets it in 1812. And here are the reasons. One, England's arming of natives on the frontiers. Warhawks really felt that the British were responsible for this resistance. They did get some weapons and aid, but it's rather limited. Two, England's continued violations of U.S. neutrality contributed to our decision to go to war, especially the memories and the bitterness over the Chesapeake Leopard affair. Pressure from Warhawks in Congress. Recall, they want more land. They want to protect American honor. They have their sights on Canada and other territory. And don't forget, the Democratic Republican Party tended to favor France in this battle over in Europe, and so the war is declared against England. We'll find out how it turns out next time. Thank you for watching the video.
All right, so that's pretty much all of Chapter 12. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and be sure you're doing your reading and your guided reading work. And again, any questions, please email me or send me a message or whatever and ask.